Hello, hello, Bogota. Bogota is like my second home. I really love Bogota, and I really look forward to the opportunity to always get an opportunity to talk with such talented and fine students in this part of the country, in South America. Um, One of my former students, Alejandro Fernandez Bernal, is teaches at one of the conservatories, and always a pleasure coming there, playing the jazz festivals, and just hanging out. In fact, there they call me Maestro, and I've done quite a few television broadcasts there, and so I walk down the street and I hear the word, "Hey, Maestro, how you doing?" But anyway, that's not what we came here to talk about today. This is a clinic for you young students who are hopefully thinking about teaching jazz or getting into jazz education or becoming better jazz musicians. The great thing that I want to talk to you guys about is that, and I got this from a very good friend of mine, Arturo Sandoval from Cuba. Arturo said, everyone, man, is all the same. And basically what he was talking about is the history and the foundation for the the popular and the dance music in whether you're in the United States, whether you're in Cuba, whether you're Colombia, whether you're in Peru, Brazil, or wherever. The foundation is the same. And it's that Afro tradition that makes such a huge difference. And so when I think about teaching jazz from a cultural standpoint, a lot of people think I was talking about combining cultures from around the world together. But when I speak of, of jazz, I'm thinking about how different aspects of the Afro American culture blended with the African tradition to make such a great and fine, I call it a souffle, a product, a mixture called jazz. In fact, I always talk about when I interview people, even when I had opportunity to meet the great Miles Davis. And for you guys that didn't know, I used to teach at East St. Louis Lincoln High School, which is the high school Miles Davis actually attended. And Miles Davis came back in 1983 playing for the Cool Jazz Festival. And the city actually gave Miles the key to the city. Also, we inducted Miles into the East St. Louis Lincoln High School Hall of Fame. And and Miles wanted to meet me, so I went over to meet Miles Davis, and we were talking. And Miles kept saying, "Ron, you know what? Uh, Cicely Tyson, his wife, said, Ron, come into the kitchen. Coming out, Miles want to meet you out there in the kitchen to speak to Cicely and Dorothy Mae Miles' sister. I went on in the actual dining room. Miles was sitting in there, and I thought Miles was going to get on my case for arranging some of his charts without proper authorization. But he said, who wrote those charts? Who arranged those charts? I said, I did. He said, good. So my heart went back in my chest. I was scared to death. And meeting your heroes is quite an adventure. And plus, I heard all the stories about Miles, but he was very kind and very forthright in his conversation. And how did you become Miles Davis? How did you learn jazz? And I asked the question I wanted to ask. And he said, well, I used to listen to the record and play the record till I played the grooves off. And he didn't say, well, Ron, when I was 16, I went to Juilliard and studied classical literature. And he talked about listening, his foundation before he actually got to New York and meeting Dizzy and meeting Charlie Parker and all those great musicians and Monk and all those great musicians. He talked about the necessity of how he used to listen. And you listen to something till you wear the grooves off. That means that's some listening you can't really put a number on. First of all, there's no number for playing the grooves off. I don't think you can play the grooves off a record. Maybe you can. I don't think you can. But he talked about listening to Bix Beiderbecke. He talked about listening to Roy Eldridge. He talked about listening to Dizzy. He talked about listening to Count Basie. He spoke the name of Duke Ellington, who he listened to. But he said, but my man was Clark Terry. I listened to Clark Terry, and Clark was smooth, man. Clark dressed real smooth and cool, man. And Clark Terry's from St. Louis, and Clark Terry was a little older than Miles, and Clark lived across the river. And Clark was already a commodity around St. Louis, East St. Louis area when Miles was just getting himself together. And what's so great about that is um, Clark Terry eventually became my mentor because I played in the same big band, the George Hudson Big Band in St. Louis, where all the professional musicians in St. Louis played in at some time or other. And out of that band came Ernie Wilkins, Jimmy Wilkins, of course. Miles played in that group at one time. Clark Terry, Mars Jamal, Jimmy Forrest, and the list goes on and on. But the great thing about it is that from talking with Clark Terry and meeting Clark Terry on several gigs that we did a reunion concert with Clark Terry. Also don't let me tell you the year because I really don't remember, but it had to be in the late 70s or early 80s. I was doing a jazz festival. I took my high school band to a jazz festival. We won the festival. But anyway, we were doing a clinic with Clark Terry, and he talked about doodle tonguing. I said, what is doodle tonguing? What is he talking about? But I knew for myself, being a classical trained clarinetist, a lot of things that I learned didn't actually work too well. Teaching jazz articulation. Ta 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 ti 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 ti, and me being a all those things just been a classical trained clarinetist playing Mozart, Weber, Haydn, Handel, Vaughan Williams. I had to learn the different aspects of jazz myself, and I was trying to figure out how can Lee Morgan sound like that, and I can't get my students to sound, articulated phrase like that. And so Clark Terry gave me an insight. He said what he learned was something he called it doodle tonguing, and that's a cultural approach. And a cultural approach, and it can be broken down in different categories. It can be broken down to the point of, and this is one mantra, all the workshops I've done coming to Bogota all these many years, is that jazz is a vocally derived art form based on the dance tradition. And that comes through the African tradition too, where music, art, and poetry are all the same. That's the cultural standpoint. And it has nothing to do with race or where you're from, but it does deal with how you identify with culture and how you operate within the system of the importance of art in the culture and the relationship between music, art, and poetry. It was crazy because of my college band, Norte Illinois University, where I was director of jazz studies there for over 23 years. We were doing a tour with the great Tito Puente, and I'm quite sure you guys know Tito Puente is a great percussionist and violinist, extraordinary jazz and Afro-Cuban a musician, but he was saying we were at a concert, and he said we were just playing. It was a big concert. We were actually doing it at a synagogue in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and we did a workshop for the kids. And he said, and then we did a concert, and he said, Ron, I don't understand in the boroughs of New York and in my home country, when we're playing the music, people are not standing around just listening; they're dancing. And so he said, I don't get that. He said, same thing Arturo Sandoval was saying too, is that relationship between music and dance is so very important, and it's very important to jazz and the foundation of jazz and the history of passing the music on, and also keeping young people interested too, that it's around us, it's in the culture. And I've learned from working with musicians from Cuba, the dance music there, and is Afro-Cuban. So that Afro means something. In Colombia, Afro-Colombian music. In Peru, Afro-Peruvian music. In the United States, Afro-American music. That Afro makes a huge difference. In the United States, most of our dance music is derived from the Afro-American tradition. In other words, Afro-American culture music, folk songs. And those things are rooted in and people understanding the necessity of the voice and the importance of passing the music on orally, listening to it. That's what Miles Davis talked about. That's cultural standpoint. And orally translating it through the voice. In other words, I have a student. He took my place at Northern Illinois University. our professor Reginald Thomas, we were doing a workshop together for the International Association of Jazz Educators. He was saying that you have to find a sonic representation of what you're trying to reproduce. And that's why listening is so important. And it's so great too. Another great friend of mine, Benny Golson, I talk to Benny Golson. I try to talk to Benny at least every 6 months, especially since all my heroes are getting older. In fact, just a side note, one of my best friends, Curtis Fuller, who played on the album Blue Train, great trombonist, a great person, a great sense of humor, a great wordsmith. I just couldn't get Curtis to do. I had to keep telling Curtis, you can't say that to young kids when we were out doing clinics while we were on tour. But anyway, Curtis talked about the importance of listening and using the voice, and how much he's listened to. And he used to put something like a little hat. We put a hat on the horn now because of COVID-19, but he put something like a little small beret over the bell of his horn, so it sounded more like the human voice. Miles Davis, when I talk to Miles, he said he uses the plunger mute and the pixie mute to sound more like the human voice. Duke Ellington used plungers and mutes, and Tricky Sam and Cootie Williams uses the plungers and the pixie mutes and the harmony mutes to sound more like the human voice. Side note, saxophones, we don't need all that because our instrument is more vocally accentuated because we vocalize the notes anyway. So we already produced the human voice sound without using quote unquote artificial means. So that's why saxophone and clarinet, those are God's instruments. Brass players don't get upset. Rhythm section don't get upset. That's just the truth. In fact, side note, I used to be a vice president of the International Association of Jazz Educators. And we were sitting, my son, Brian Carter, who's a great musician in New York, went to Juilliard. We were sitting at the table with the great Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones was getting the National Endowment of the Arts Award. And we were just talking. And that's one thing, I'm always asking questions. That's why I think about it all the time, that I've learned so much, because I'm not afraid to let people know I don't know things. And I'm always asking questions. But we were talking to Quincy Jones, and he said, well, you know, Ron, the saxophone is the voice of the jazz band. And I thought about that. I said, yeah, that's right. If your saxophone section is right, your band is going to be much better. Of course, we know the rhythm section controls everything. But anyway, I like saying that. But the sound of the saxophone section is so important to creating that cultural relationship between the human voice. Also, in my years of experience of working with the great Benny Golson again, go back to Benny. Benny Golson said, if you hear a sound that you really like, or a song you even like, or a certain texture you say, ooh, I love that sound. He said, and it's just his words, he said that sound is already inside of you. And most of us spend a lifetime trying to connect with something inside of it. So when you hear something, you like it, that's why you listen to it over and over and try to reproduce it. I remember when I first started playing, I used to love listening to Cannonball Adderley and Stanley Turrentine, and then I got into Charlie Parker, and what I learned too was that all those things come through my playing at different times. It's going to what mood I'm in and how I'm trying to express myself on the instrument. That's very, very important. Also, I always tell people, you know, I'm a classically trained musician. I was an all-state clarinetist in the state of Georgia. All my degrees are in classical clarinet, playing Mozart and Weber and those things. But guess what? I started playing professionally at 13 or 14 years old. And I feel that gave me an insight into learning how to use a cultural approach to learning jazz and learning jazz music, learn all these different things that we talk about that are so important to passing on jazz, quote unquote, in a more of a cultural approach. And that culture we're talking about is through the Afro approach, the Afro diaspora tradition. You know, was the Yoruba tribes and different tribes from West Africa and South Africa that came when slaves were brought to different parts of the world. I always tell everybody the greatest gift that the slave trade gave to America, of course, was the foundation of what we call jazz now. And I keep repeating this. Miles never called it jazz. He called it soul music. When I did an interview with the great Ivan Baptiste, he always called it black music. He never called it jazz. So I think that Ivan Baptiste made one great, I remember this quotation that changed my whole approach to teaching. He said record labels and companies, which they're thinking basically about stockholders and the bottom line, they took black music, Afro-American music, and put it in different categories in order to market it to the world, made it easier to market. But what that did, it pitted so many of us against each other. Gospel musicians is trying to say, well, I don't like jazz musicians, they can't do this, or bebop musicians don't like smooth jazz musicians, or smooth jazz musicians don't like swing musicians, or jazz vocalists don't like whatever. And so when the great Arturo Sandoval told me it's all the same, and I came to recollection it's all the same. When I taught high school, we played all types of music. We played gospel, we played all types of jazz, bebop jazz, smooth jazz, hip-hop jazz, country western jazz. We played everything. Basically, we put improvisation in everything. And when we toured, we toured with the East St. Louis Lincoln High School Jazz Band, but also we toured with the East St. Louis Lincoln High School Gospel Horns. I would take everybody in the band who could sing and put them in a choir. And then the rest of it, I would arrange octet and smaller arrangements of gospel tunes, and we played that. And that's how we raised funds as we toured around the country. We do gospel concerts and we do jazz concerts. And I think that's so very important. And even now, my son was telling me, he said, Dad, a lot of my friends now are moving to Nashville because the country music, association of country music in Nashville is a huge market, but they're now using many, many more jazz and rhythm and blues trained musicians to play the music, and it's changed the whole sound of the genre. But what it does is taken things that Elvis Presley knew many years ago, and Dolly Parton knew many years ago, and country Charlie Pride knew many years ago, that the African tradition of the blues, the Afro-American tradition of the blues, is in country music. It just had a steel guitar, and initially had the German 1 and 3 hand clap. Now it's all 2 and 4, which is more Afro, quote unquote Afro-American rhythm blues, jazz, what have you, where you clap on 2 and 4. In other words, we wouldn't play. You get a line and I get a pole, baby. Do, 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 do. You get a line and I get a pole, babe. That German 1 and 3 heavy beat, rather than, and believe it or not, in quote unquote, and most people don't know this, is that in Africa they actually clap on 1 and 3 too. But guess what? And through research, through a lot of research I've learned from Hamid Blood and the World Saxophone Quartet, they were saying that the 2 and 4 actually came from the Native American. And so we do, you get line and I get a pole, baby. That clap on 2 and 4s is the clave for Afro-American music, for Afro-American rhythm and blues and jazz. Very important. It's just as important as the 2-3, 3-2 clave and Afro-Cuban music and what have you. But anyway, I digress, and I want to leave that alone for now. But it's very important to understand when we talk about a cultural standpoint, we are really talking about finding ways to make whatever music you play in your program relevant. In other words, if I would have taken a job and the greatest aspect of my job was, of course, was the culture was based on country western music, I will find a way to incorporate that into the jazz language, use that. And Miles Davis is a great example of that, how he used fusion and mixed all types of music, and still made it hip and still jazz. Even though some people have tried to say, well, that's not jazz. No, it is jazz. When we start putting things in a category, then we start confusing. And then we can say, well, jazz is dead. No, jazz will never be dead. As long as there's dance music in this world, jazz will never be dead. And one thing I always told my students, once you learn uh, jazz from a cultural standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, you're never at a point where you have to worry about how you're going to make a living, because it becomes all the same. Whether you in the studio playing with Beyonce, or on tour with the Glenn Miller Band, on tour with the Afro-Cuban Band, with a salsa band, on tour with the Jazz Lincoln Orchestra, doesn't make a difference. And I said, now I always tell my students, approach all the music from a cultural standpoint, so you understand that your true definition is jazz is a vocally derived art form based on the dance tradition. And that Afro-American tradition of the folk music being combined with the culture around us, and combined with the culturalization of different other cultures that make this music so foundational, and that aspect of understanding the importance of enjoying the music, whether you think it's in a category of jazz or gospel or whatever. One thing about it too is that my students used to ask me all the time, Professor Carter, I have a question for you. We just did a concert. How did we do? I said, you don't need to ask me that. If you don't see the audience doing like this, it's a funk tune. Or jazz. And so weird, even when I go to a classical concert, my wife tell me, can't you just sit still? Because they're playing and get into those vibes. So I find a way to, yeah. And it's so weird. I actually worked for Jazz in Lincoln Center in New York with another great trumpet player. It's so weird. My relationships have been with a lot of trumpet players as far as learning jazz, but I guess there's nothing wrong with that. Between Miles and Clark Terry, and also a relationship I have with the great Wynton Marsalis. One thing that Wynton started a program in New York called the Essentialton Program, and I helped started that program. And I used to talk about the importance of dance and music and vocalize the music. And when I took over the Jazz Links and the Band Director Academy, that became the foundational curriculum for the entire festival, for the teaching festival for teachers from all over the world. And that program is still going on. I don't work with the program anymore, but that program is still going on. And check it out. It's called the Jazz Links and the Band Director Academy. We know eventually COVID will allow us to get back out and enjoy each other's company, enjoy dancing and listening to great and going to concerts. And I'm praying that because of this, people will appreciate musicians even much more, because of, guess what? Because we've had this dry spell where we couldn't get out and enjoy music and enjoy live concerts, enjoy each other. So we're hoping that will happen, and happen soon. One thing I learned too is that when we speak of jazz being a universal language, and from me having an opportunity to present clinics in Spanish-speaking countries, and my Spanish is terrible. My son speaks Spanish very well. In fact, he took it all the way through high school. But I know baño, and I know taco. I know a few words. But anyway, not much. But I always have a translator when I come over there, but guess what? I never need it. Because once we start dealing with the music, nobody even worry about the language. But what I will tell everyone is that a lot of the syllables, the vowel sounds that we have in the English language will have to be modified in order to teach that concept using the Spanish language. I have two former grad students, Julio Calaman from Brazil, and then Alejandro Fernandez. I'm talking about taking Portuguese and taking Spanish and finding different ways to use the same concept, because the concept is what we're talking about. It's not the actual what I do. It's just the concept of what I do. Finding a way to adapt this to the Spanish language. And we even have our website now for Carter's Jazz Clinics. We have a website in Spanish now. And so we are making that, since I've invited many of my students, former students from Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking countries to Spanish-speaking countries to actually join Carter's Jazz Clinics. And I think it's only proper that we start offering things in that language and translation, whatever. But I will talk about the vocal approach, which is a cultural approach. One concept in all my textbooks. And my textbooks are called Teaching Music to Performance in Jazz. And the books, this is the first book I did in 2008, and I did 2 more since then. We have a new textbook coming out in 2022. And believe it or not, we're doing a whole chapter with Julio and Alejandro will be writing an entire chapter in the book on cultural approach to teaching Afro-Cuban and Brazilian jazz. And it will be a way for many people around the world who really don't understand the culture of the music to learn how to find ways to start incorporating more authenticity in the performance of the music. Because we have to do the same way I'm doing that for jazz, we have to do the same thing for Afro-Cuban and Brazilian samba and different types of music. Because I've learned so much from my graduate students I've worked with over the last 40 years that have come from it. And I learned so much from Claudio Redidi and Arturo Sandoval and Tito Puente and Paquito de Rivera. I've learned so much from just working with those guys and just asking questions, how do I make this more authentic? And also a young man from Peru that has a great group that plays Afro-Peruvian music. And that music is totally different from playing Afro-Cuban music or Brazilian samba music. The Afro-Peruvian music uses a cajon. And we're talking about how people from different cultures have taken things from the culture and use those things to make music and still combine them to make dance music. The cajon and their clave is totally different. And I've learned so much from Gabriel Alegria. He taught me a lot about the music, and I know enough just to make a fool out of myself. But anyway, if you get an opportunity to check them out, his Afro-Peruvian group, he's actually head of the jazz program now at New Jersey City State University in New Jersey. So check him out and check his group out. He has plenty of recordings out, but the music is just unbelievable. And it will allow, to understand how the language spoken is Spanish, but the music is totally different, because how the African tradition influenced the music enjoyment, the culture there in Peru is totally different than how it happened in Cuba, how it happened in Colombia, and of course how it happened in New Orleans and Chicago and Memphis and what have you. And it's just, if I had a opportunity to go back and get a doctorate, I would get in anthropology, because I love to study how the African tradition just, and I also learned from the study I've been doing during COVID, as how the polyrhythms from certain aspect of Africa, certain tribes in Africa, certain regions of Africa, the polyrhythms are what I call it the African 12/8. Those different things, those polyrhythms uh, came about to make the dance film. And the dance, we've talked a lot about the vocal approach, but also this in the cultural approach. But also, I learned from another great friend of mine um, by the name of Ed Thigpen. And Ed Thigpen also has a history of playing in the George Harrison Big Band many, many years ago. And his brother, Ben Sid Thigpen, also lived in St. Louis and played in a lot of jazz groups around St. Louis. But the great thing about Ed Thigpen is this, guys, is that he played with Oscar Peterson, of course, for many years. He played his own big band. You know, he subbed in the Basie band and different bands. He taught at university at one time, University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. But the great thing about him is that he and I developed such a strong relationship because of all the studying I'd done as far as trying to find ways of why, when I left East St. Louis, where culturally the church was so strong in all my students, the thing of vocalizing, singing in church, and everybody thought they could dance. It was already prevalent in the cultures. I took it for granted. When I went to Northern Illinois University, I asked the students, how many guys sing? Nobody sang. How many guys danced? Nobody danced. And so I knew I had to take a totally different approach. And plus, my wife always would tell me, "Oh, your college band is good, but they're not Lincoln High School." And I said, "Hold up now. My students are very talented." And I finally sit back and listen to what she was talking about. There was a certain feel of inflections that came through the Afrocentric study of the music, the Afro-American culture, combined with the music that made such a difference in how the music was being translated to the audience. And so I started having my students do all the things my students in East St. Louis just did anyway. I mean, we were singing, but I never had to work on dance because they all thought they could dance anyway. And so when I started working at Northern, we had to work on, quote unquote, understanding the African 12/8. The triple field. Drop it like it's hot, yeah. A drop it like it's hot, yeah. A cheese cut, cheese cut, cheese cut, cheese cut. Off, spang, spang-a-lang, 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 or dealing with the duple feel, which is in a lot of the Afro-Cuban music, a lot of the Afro-Peruvian, Afro-Colombian music, the duple feel is there. That's so important to understand. And so once you get that foundation, in fact, groups I've worked with, we have two major competitions in the United States. One is I've worked with for over 25 years, is Cincy Ellington, and another one that I work with a lot of bands that have participated in that one, called Swing Central in Savannah, Georgia. All the bands that have won those festivals have been bands that I've mentored through the quote unquote cultural approach to jazz. And the great thing about that, and in fact, I wrote my textbooks after I judged those tapes for 10 years. I was saying the same thing over and over. So I said, I need to put this in a textbook. So guess what? It's all in there. And it's in book 2, book 3, and book 4 going to come out in another year. But I did that so I wouldn't have to say the same thing again. I say it again, but over and over. And all those bands that have won that, and most of the bands that actually make it to New York or make it to Savannah are bands that I've mentored and worked with over the last 20, 30, and 35 years. And the great thing about that is that we have a common language and a common approach to a cultural approach. In fact, a good friend of mine, Steve Sfiem, and Steve Sfiem is Norwegian, so he's definitely not Afro-American, okay? But he's I always call him my brother from another mother, because we're just that close. In fact, I hired him as soon as he retired from teaching. And this band made it to New York, the finals there, 19 times out of 25 years. And they placed 4 or 5 times. And so, which is phenomenal. But the thing is, before any piece of music he passes out to his band, they find out whether it's duple or triple. They dance to it, then they sing it, then they play it. What do most bands do when they get a piece of music? Man, we showing these, look at these notes and these rhythms. This stuff look hard. We need to try to play this music. But no, he don't approach it that way. You know, he have them dancing to it. Dee, dee, do, dee, do, dee, da. Dee, do, dee, 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 do, dee, do, da. Or do, 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 dee, dee, do, dee, 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 do, do, dee, 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 or do, dee, 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 do, dee. Duple, triple, and so that's the important thing. When you start thinking about a cultural approach, what does that mean? That means every piece of music you get, you got to approach it orally, listen to it, orally sing it, and find the groove, whether it's duple, or triple, and if you approach it that way, I guarantee you, if Miles Davis, and I'm quite sure Miles, and I'm not sure, but I think Miles had perfect pitch. I know Wynton has perfect pitch. In fact, the whole trumpet section of Jazz Lincoln Orchestra has perfect pitch. And but that doesn't make you a great musician. Learn how to use the perfect pitch makes you a great musician. Learn how to swang. And swang is different from swing. Swing is ta 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 ta. Swang is do do de do de da do 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 da. It's a difference. Yeah. It's a difference. And so any piece of music, and also try to find out any piece of music you're going to work on. Try to find out the history of it. A good former student of mine, Luis Martinez, lives in Chiapas, Mexico. And I tried to experiment. I gave him a lot of the Centralton charts. And he was one of my grad students, and he was in my jazz pedagogy course. And he went back and started a jazz band there at his university, University of Mexico, Chiapas. And they really sound great. But he's the same thing we're talking about. In fact, we're planning a tour there. The end of the middle of 2022, I think, with Carter's Jazz Clinics. We're taking a quintet or quartet over there to teach and play for a week. As soon as they, gets control of COVID over there, we'll see how it works out. But whenever that happens, but he approaches it the same way, and I really want to find young people who are willing to take these concepts and, regardless of what the language is, find a way to use Clark Terry's doodle tongue method, where he takes the D attack, D, and add the English vowels, A-E-I-O-U, day, dee, da, do, do. Just try it. Day, dee, da, do, do. Try it. Day, dee, da, do, do. Try it again. Day, dee, da, do, do. One more time. Day, dee, da, do, do. I know. Now you have to find out how that works in the Spanish language. I don't know. I'm sorry. I can't help it. But I know Alejandro and Julio are gonna work all these things out over the next year or so. Because we're gonna sit down and we're gonna work on it over and over until we find a way to translate and make it work more effectively. Make it work more effectively in the the Spanish language, okay, and the Portuguese language. Now check this out. Clark Terry said doodle tonguing. Doodle la, doodle la, doodle la. Now ta 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 ta. You know, so great is how Dizzy Gillespie and China Poser and all those great different musicians work together and brought the two I call it the two worlds of the African tradition, the duple and triple together in jazz and Afro-Cuban, Afrocentric, Afro-Colombian music, brought those things together. And what's great about that is that it still works the same way once you learn how to sing things. And a good friend of mine, Wycliffe Gordon, says this, if you can sing it, then you can play it. Now, that's not always the case. Hey, now when it comes to Wycliffe, because Wycliffe can play anything, So you have to slow it down. If the phrase is fast, slow it down, learn how to sing it. If you go on YouTube, slow it down to 50%, sing it slow. Hello. Go up to 75%, sing it a little faster, then get it up tempo. But the great thing about that is, guys, is this. Anytime you're trying to sing something, you take those syllables. Day, dee, da, do, do. Daddle, deedle, daddle, doodle, doodle. Try it. Daddle, deedle, daddle, doodle, doodle. The tongue goes in a different place. Doodle, 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 doodle. Doodle, 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 doodle. So, of course, if you're playing a flute, a saxophone, or whatever, you can't say daddle, deedle, daddle, doodle. You say doodle, 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 doodle. Doodle, 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 doodle. And I tell all my students in high school, I tell all my students in college, and I teach all my students I go out and work with all over the world the same thing. And I owe it all to the great Clark Terry, my good friend, my mentor, and my hero, But it's great to understand, too, that then you can start singing phrases like rhythms in the jazz language, eighth note, quarter note, eighth note. It's not ta ta ta. It's do dit dot, a do dit dot, a do dit dot. The first is long. Do is long. Do. Everybody say do. Now all this is in the textbook, and you can get these through GI publications or JW Pepper or any major company you can order them from. But let you guys know too that anybody that's just tell them that you did the workshop with Carter's Jazz Clinics, and he'll give you 20% off on the CD and the book, 20% off. So get it, okay? But but you have to go. Of course, you have to go to GIE Publications in Chicago and order it. But just give them the code. If you need the code, call me. I'll give you the code, or email me rather, at www.cartersjazzclinics.com. Okay? And just www.cartersjazzclinics.com. And I'll give you the code to order the book at a 20% discount, and the CD that comes along with a discount. The great thing about the CD is that we add all the different things we talked about. Cultural standpoint, everything's approached vocally, everything's approached through dance being important, and those things all being and through listening at that level. And this chart, even the easier charts, are performed with that amount of expertise. It's like giving the Duke Ellington Band a grade 2 chart and say, play this for me. Thank you, good, Mr. Marshall Royal, Mr. Johnny Hodges, Mr. Lawrence Brown, Mr. Cootie Williams. Thank you for playing that easy chart for me, making it sound so good. And so make sure you check that out. But also a lot of things in the book is called a vocal approach to jazz education. The dance part is called internalizing the jazz feel. All these things are put in the book so you can teach yourself the concept and then find a way for you to learn how to teach and teach yourself. Because the great thing about language, whether you learn Spanish, Portuguese, English, Swahili, is that nobody really teaches you those languages. we are programmed. We are programmed to want to learn language, and we put the time in. You know, if you notice a small child, they might say da da goo goo 1,000 times, but pretty soon they'll have passed the bottle. Yeah, I need that bottle, mama. Yeah, Poppy, I need the bottle. But they're going to get to that point at one time, and it's just because of the effort. And I do a lot of traveling around the world, and I sit next to people from different cultures, different languages, and babies. You know, I don't want to sit next to anybody right now in COVID, but anyway, during normal times, you know, I hear kids babbling, and babbling sounds like babbling. I don't care if they're babbling in Hebrew or babbling in English, Spanish, Portuguese. It's all the same. Still sounds like, you know, whatever. But how it's formulated to language is from just trial and error. So learn the jazz language and understand jazz language is the same thing. So you have to get to the point where you learn the syllables, but it's not about syllables. It's about phrases. In other words, check this out. You can say that long note is do, okay? Okay? Short note, accent is dot. Short note, not accent is did. Accent, da, okay? Do, did, da. That's a phrase. Do, they do, did. Ghost note, do, they do, da. Triplets. Do, they did, do, they do, did, da. It's not. They do, they did, do, they do, did, da. That's corny. Corny means bad in English, okay? That's bad. I don't know what you say in Spanish. I don't know if you say that's nasty or that's bad. Well, but anyway, it's not good. Do, did, da. Or things like, now, just remember that what we're learning how to do is sing jazz phrases. We're not learning how to scat. Scat is something totally different, okay? But guess what? Scatting still has the swing. And scatting is nonsensical syllables. In fact, Louis Armstrong said he started scatting, but he forgot the words to the song. And it's crazy. I was listening to I was laughing because one of my former students was doing an interview on Zoom for a big radio station in London, England. She lives in Chicago. She's a Grammy-nominated, Stella Award-winning, Stella-nominated gospel singer, Anita Wilson. And I thought I was the one to forget words to the song. She said, you know, I forgot words to songs before. The songs I've actually written, I've forgotten the words, you know, in the heat of the moment. So if Louis Armstrong can forget some words and make up some syllables, I can do that. So now I don't worry about it. If I forget a word, I just throw in there, yeah, baby. Oh, yeah, you know. I said, yeah, boy. I make it work. Make it work. In other words, you must take the A train. Find the quickest way that you can get to Harlem. But if I'm singing that and trying to learn the jazz phrase and trying to learn the jazz language, why did I say that? Because we don't want to remediate. Remediate means learn something and have to relearn it in order to do it. So to non-remediate, so we could doodle tongue in saxophone. We call it off and on tongue and legato tongue, but it's all the same. Okay. But anyway, I'm watching the clock because I was told it should be 50 minutes, and I've been trying to keep it out. And everybody know me, especially you guys in Bogota. I've been to the conservatory many times and did workshops and clinics. I can be a bit long-winded, but I'm trying to not be so long-winded this time. And plus, I get a chance to later on that you can ask questions. But again, I want to thank you guys. I want to thank all of my consultants at Miss Alyssa Jones. Also, everybody with Carter's Jazz Clinics, LLC. If you want to contact me again, it's www.cartersjazzclinics.com, or you can email me, Ronald Okay, Ronald CRTR@gmail.com. Ronald RONALD CRTR@gmail.com. If you want to email me, any questions you want to ask, I'm always available. And if you want us to come to your conservatory and play, we have an artist section of that are just artists. We have clinicians that are artists, so we fulfill any type of demand or any type of desire you have for us to come and work with your bands, do a week's residency when COVID is under control. But again, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you guys today. And I'll get a chance to answer your questions, hopefully in a few weeks. Keep swinging, everybody.